Hello, welcome to Unit 5 of our course. I look forward to working with you. In this unit, we will be exploring two important themes: Western expansion of the United States, and also the history of slavery. In terms of the Western expansion of the United States, you have a discussion board question related to this topic. You will be asked to post a minimum of 3 comments related to this discussion board question, as usual. And in terms of the history of slavery, you will be asked to read the journals of a slave master from Louisiana, and then to write a blog post in relation to the views of slave masters and the experience of slaves during the 19th century, the 1800s. So you have 2 assignments to complete this week. One assignment is the discussion board, and the second assignment is the blog post. You also do have the typical reading assignment to complete. You're asked to read chapters 12, 13, and 14 of Boundless, in addition to reading the selection from the journal of the slave master that you're asked to read. So I'd like to, in this introductory video, discuss briefly the 2 topics for your assignments in the hopes that this will be helpful to you. So I'd like to start with Western expansion. As many of you are likely aware or have been learning in this course, the United States did not begin as a continental nation. The United States did not begin as a nation extending from the East Coast to the West Coast as it does today. When the United States formally gained its independence from Britain, the United States included the territory from the East Coast, the 13 original colonies, up west to the Mississippi River, south of Canada, not including Florida, because Florida was a Spanish colony still. So the United States was only less than half of the geographical territory that it is today. It was confined to the area east of the Mississippi River, and it did not include Florida. In fact, much of this territory itself was not really incorporated fully into the United States. It was territory that had not yet been settled and incorporated as states as well. So initially there were only 13 states all along the eastern seaboard. Over time, of course, the United States would gradually expand westward. This took on 2 different meanings, essentially. One was the actual migration of American peoples westward into lands that had previously been occupied and settled by Native American peoples. This process had begun really in 1607 with the first settlement at Jamestown. Europeans, along with typically African slaves, moving westward. So this process continued after the American Revolution, and you have American settlers moving west, initially moving west into places like Kentucky, Tennessee, moving from states like Virginia westward into Kentucky and Tennessee, moving from New York into Ohio, moving westward slowly into the territories of the Ohio River Valley, gradually moving westward. There are actually people who specialized in moving west and settling, breaking the land, if you will. This was a very difficult task. So moving west involved a number of dangers. There was always the danger of conflict with Native Americans, who of course wanted to defend their ancestral lands from encroachment by American settlers, for obvious reasons. There was also the hardship of clearing the land for agriculture oftentimes. Much of this land was occupied by peoples who were hunter-gatherer peoples, so they had not cleared the land for agriculture. It was heavily forested. So oftentimes Americans moving west, had to undertake the heavy labor of, clearing the forests, digging up the stumps and roots of trees and making it into farmland, essentially, which is what they desired, what they wanted. Um, so this was heavy, difficult labor. And some were not creating farms for their own permanent settlement. They essentially were doing this as a living. They would clear land, sell the land, then at a profit, move further west, clear land, sell the land at a profit, and then move to the next frontier. And you always had people who wanted to purchase land that had already been cleared. So you did have these sort of professional frontiersmen, if you will, who continued moving further westward to the next frontier and the next frontier. So that was one interesting aspect of the process. Um, the idea of the lone individual striking it out west is a sort of iconic image in American history and culture. It's not really accurate though. People moved west in groups typically. Um, it was fairly unheard of and quite rare for individuals to be striking it out west on their own. You're talking about groups of people moving west for common security, if nothing else, as well as community. So that's a bit of an iconic image, the lone frontiersman, but it's not entirely accurate in that sense, in that respect. In addition to this westward movement and settlement that's going on throughout early American history, you also have the actual expansion of the territorial boundaries of the nation. The first major example of this, and the largest example of this, was the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Territory had been controlled by France. However, it had never really been heavily settled by the French. The only community that actually had a sizable French population was the city of New Orleans, a major port facility at the mouth of the Mississippi River. Did have a sizable French population and Creole population. Now, there were some French fur traders in the much larger Louisiana Territory, but fairly sparsely populated in terms of European settlement. Of course, there were Native Americans inhabiting the territory. The French had always had difficulty encouraging people to settle in the Americas. France was a very prosperous country in the 18th century, and frankly, few people wanted to leave France. So there was very little push to leave France, and it was hard to settle the Americas. Napoleon Bonaparte took power in France by the beginning of the 19th century, beginning of the 1800s, and he frankly had, in his view, more important issues at hand than settling the Americas. He was bent on a campaign to conquer all of Europe. He was at war with Britain, he was at war with almost the entire continent of Europe, and he would ultimately conquer much of Europe. And the Americas were not his principal concern. Meanwhile, as American settlers gradually moved west into the Ohio River Valley, into the area of the Great Lakes, and as American agriculture expanded west, Americans took more and more interest in the Port of New Orleans. Farms that were located around the Great Lakes and farms that were located around the Ohio River Valley, increasingly these farms, in order to be profitable, needed to be able to ship their goods down the Mississippi River to the port at New Orleans. It was incredibly expensive to ship goods overland. You have to remember there were no good roads. The Erie Canal hadn't been built yet. It sounds strange, but the cheapest way to ship goods was by river, and it was a lot cheaper to ship goods all the way down the Mississippi River to New Orleans than it was to ship them west across, the Appalachian Mountains. It was much cheaper to ship them by river. So it was crucial to the success of American Western expansion that the U.S. have continued access to the port of New Orleans, and there was always the fear that as long as New Orleans remained in foreign hands, that we could potentially lose access to trading privileges in the port. So Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, decided to send a delegation to France to try to negotiate with Napoleon and see if we could purchase just the port of New Orleans to make it an American territory. When, though, American negotiators reached France, it became clear quite quickly that Napoleon wanted to be rid of his whole American colonial empire, and he basically wanted to sell the entire Louisiana territory, which would increase the size of the United States by almost double its original size. And faced with this, Jefferson felt he could not turn down this opportunity, and the United States purchased the entire Louisiana territory, vastly increasing the size of the United States, purchasing it from France. Some thought this was folly at the time. We were a country that essentially had no money and had a lot of land, and here we were spending millions of dollars that we didn't have for more land, much more land than we could settle in the foreseeable future. But I do think strategically, in terms of if you're looking to increase the power of the United States over time, that it likely was the correct decision on Jefferson's part to expand the territorial possessions of the United States. Of course, one runs into the ethical and moral question regarding was it proper to expand westward, because this would ultimately involve the displacement of native peoples. Of course, this was an issue of how we expanded westward as well. We didn't have to displace native peoples. That was a choice on the part of the settlers, I would argue. And it was a choice on the part of our government how to deal with native peoples and the lands that we acquired. And generally, the choice was made to engage in essentially genocidal campaigns and campaigns to displace local peoples, tragically. So that was one vast territorial acquisition that the United States made. A second territorial acquisition that the United States made came through the acquisition of Texas. The narrative of this begins in the early 1800s. Mexico gains its independence, and the northern provinces of Mexico, including Texas, were very sparsely populated. They had Native American inhabitants, but very few European inhabitants, or Mexican inhabitants, Spanish inhabitants. And Mexico was not generating very much revenue from its northernmost provinces, especially Texas. Texas, of course, bordered the United States, and the Mexican government hoped that if they could invite American settlers to come into Texas, that they could generate tax revenue, essentially. This ultimately proved to be a mistake for Mexico. It would prove to be misguided. In principle, it could work, but ultimately the Americans that they invited in would seek independence from Mexico. So the Mexican government initially granted huge land grants to American settlers in Mexico. Now, they were to be part of Mexico and to pay taxes to the Mexican government, but soon tensions flared between the American settlers and the Mexican government. Some of the tensions that emerged: one, the Mexican government required that all American settlers become Roman Catholics. Almost all of them refused to do so. Two, the Mexican government was trying to collect taxes from the American settlers. Many of them refused to pay taxes. And three, the Mexican government required that they at least nominally or in name only free their slaves, and the settlers from America refused to do so as well. Ultimately, tensions flared up and a war erupted, which led to the declaration of independence by the American settlers in Texas. Texas remained a separate nation for a brief period of time, and then after a number of years, it became part of the United States. It became a state in the United States. Then later in 1845 to 1848, a war erupted between the United States and Mexico itself, the Mexican War. The United States defeated Mexico in this war, and as a result gained a huge swath of territory that had previously belonged to Mexico, including, most importantly, the state of California, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, parts of Wyoming, Colorado, etc. became part of the United States. So the United States continued to expand westward all the way to the Pacific. There was a settlement between the United States and Britain, dividing the Oregon Territory, through which the United States gained Oregon and Washington, what is now Washington State, as well. And so the geography of the United States began to take shape. The question you're asked on the discussion board is, was this inevitable, that the United States would expand westward? Was it manifest destiny, quote unquote? The term manifest destiny was originated in the 19th century. It was first introduced in the 1800s to suggest that this was destiny means something that's fated to happen. It's inevitable, essentially. The term destiny has a very long history in the West, in Western culture. It goes back all the way to the ancient Greeks, essentially. Western civilization can trace its origins back to the ancient Greeks. And the Greeks had a very clear belief in destiny. The Greeks believed that each person was born with a particular destiny that they could not ultimately escape. No matter what they did with their lives, their destiny would ultimately play itself out. One example of this that perhaps you're familiar with is the famous play Oedipus Rex, or King Oedipus. In this play, Oedipus is born into a royal family. The ancient Greeks also believed that that people could see the future. So in this play, Oedipus's parents, when he's an infant, go to see one of these fortune tellers, essentially. And the fortune teller reveals a horrible destiny to them. The fortune teller says, this infant, Oedipus, one day will grow up, and he will murder his father and marry his mother. So, of course, the father and mother of Oedipus are horrified by this. How can they prevent this from happening, his destiny from being fulfilled? Well, they decide, well, if they essentially get rid of the boy, if they have no contact with him, then clearly this destiny can never take place. So they get rid of the boy, give him up. He's taken in by a family many, many miles away, adopted. So he has adoptive parents who don't reveal to him that they're not his biological parents. When he becomes an adult, Oedipus himself goes and sees another fortune teller, a seer. And the fortune teller tells him, in the future, you will kill your father and marry your mother. That's your destiny. Oedipus, of course, is horrified by this, and so he decides the only way to avoid his destiny is to flee from his parents. He doesn't know that his adoptive parents aren't his biological parents. So he flees from his household, the only household he's ever known. And as he's fleeing westward on the road, he encounters what he doesn't know is his biological father and kills him, returns to his original home city and marries whom he doesn't know is his mother, and fulfills his destiny unwittingly. So this is the idea of destiny, that your fate is sealed. No matter how much you try to run from it, eventually it will be fulfilled. There's nothing you can do to avoid it. So the idea of manifest destiny in American history was that it was inevitable that the United States would expand westward to become a continental nation. Historians, I think, generally are skeptical, contemporary historians are skeptical of the concept of destiny. I'm skeptical of the concept of destiny in my historical studies. It removes the notion of human agency, and essentially that's what historians study. We study how human beings um, shape history through their actions. So, um, you know, I personally am somewhat skeptical of the notion of destiny. Now, one could argue, conditions being what they were, there was a very high probability that the United States would expand westward. So, what were the conditions that made this probable? Well, the United States was a dynamic nation in the 19th century, the early 1800s. We were a nation that was attracting large numbers of immigrants from Europe. There was a tremendous amount of unrest in Europe, conflict and warfare, and the United States was an appealing destination for immigrants in search of land. The steady influx of immigrants, as well as domestic population growth, did create a pressure for westward expansion. As an agrarian nation and a plantation-based economy, at least in the South, there was a continuing pressure for more and more land amongst Americans who were seeking to profit and enrich themselves. So certainly, given the realities of the American economic system, there was a movement for land. Given the realities of immigration, there was a drive for continuing land to the west. This created forces that pushed for westward expansion. Not without choices, but certainly the conditions were ripe for westward expansion in that sense. There was no great military power to our west in the 19th century. None of the native tribes were a formidable military power in comparison to the United States. None had a reasonable chance of containing the United States if it chose to move westward. I think that's fairly clear. Nor did Mexico have a formidable military force capable of stopping American westward expansion. States do tend to expand until they confront states that have the military capability of stopping them. If you look at European history, this has generally been true. So one could argue that conditions in that sense were ripe for American expansion. So there certainly were factors that could lead one to argue that it was likely that America would expand westward, but people still had to act. People still had to make decisions. People still made choices. Men like Andrew Jackson still chose to displace natives from their lands. People still chose to launch military campaigns. There was still a choice to drive natives from their lands. So I think it's problematic to say that it was all manifest destiny, that it was inevitably going to happen. I think that removes human agency a bit too much, I would argue. Does it seem likely that there would be an alternative? Perhaps not, given the realities of the culture of the period, the realities of military power in the period. The likely result is what happened, perhaps, but certainly there was human agency involved, I would argue. Now, the second issue that we're exploring this week is the mindset of slave owners, which I think in reading the Journal of the Louisiana Slave Owner, you'll get at least some insight into it. It's pretty disturbing, perhaps not surprisingly. Slavery is an incredibly perverse system. It's not normal. It's not a normal way to live. to own slaves. And you see that reflected in the journal of this Louisiana slave owner. He's frequently whipping his slaves. He regards this as a part of his everyday life. He seems not to be bothered by this. He certainly doesn't seem to be morally affected by it. He doesn't think it's wrong, seemingly. And he seems like a fairly depraved individual from his journal. I don't think there's any way around that in looking at the journal. Slavery tended to brutalize turn slave masters into people who were quite brutal and inhuman. So you certainly see that reflected. You could not own human beings and brutalize, beat, and terrorize people and remain and be a good person. It's not possible. So I think you see that reflected in the text. A lot of what we know about slavery comes from the perspective of slave owners. They were more likely to leave behind journals than were slaves. We do have some slave narratives, thankfully. There's been an effort to recover that material, but unfortunately, I would say we have more written records from slave masters than we do from slaves. They tended to leave behind more written records. It was illegal to teach slaves to read or write for much of American history. So we often see slavery through the perspective of the slave masters. You don't see this reflected in the journal, but I'd like to add a little bit more of what you don't see in the journal about slave life, the life of slave masters. The household was also very strange for plantation on the plantation. So imagine a slave master almost always was married. So he had a wife who was Caucasian, and a slave master almost always had children with his wife, recognized children, white children. But then there were house slaves who would work in the house, and generally, slave masters also had children with slaves in the house. The slave masters raped female slaves and had children with slaves living in their household. So slave masters had both white children who they formally recognized as their children and acknowledged as their children living in their household, but they also had mixed racial children who were the children of their children and the children of their slaves living in their household, whom they didn't acknowledge as their children, but clearly were, whom they owned as slaves. So when I say it was perverse, it was a perverse system. Everyone knew this, but no one talked about it. It was taboo. You couldn't say anything about it, but it was known. Everyone knew. The children looked like each other. They resembled each other. Everyone could see that the children were of mixed racial ancestry. They were biracial. Everyone knew that they were the children of the slave master. The slave master's wife knew that wives knew that their husbands had children with the slaves who were in the household. Think about the dynamics within the slave master's households. When you often read accounts, if you read about the history of slavery, that slave masters' wives would brutalize, especially the house slaves, the slave women who lived in the household. They would viciously attack them. The dynamics of the household. The wives of the slave masters knew that their husbands were having sex with, raping the slaves in the household. So you have all of these forces at play within the slave master's households. So it was an incredibly complex, perverse, unnatural, and inhuman system at play. Yet the slave masters always presented themselves as, good Christian men, who said their prayers and took care of their families, you know, but the reality was quite different. I think I'll leave it there. So I hope that this was helpful, and I will participate in the discussion board.